Well, this is my latest foray into the simulation of what the Ammann brothers might have been doing, using the electrical equivalent of two hollow spheres on either side of a transformer coil in the middle that is contained within the steel drum strapped to the front end of their car. It started off, the two headlights have connected to them the two terminals of an ignition coil. I thought, might as well make use of it. They probably held it over from the original version of their gasoline-fired car. And it does help, especially if you're trying to get a normal spark gap to fire up rather than a neon bulb, and a normal spark gap will handle higher voltages than a neon bulb, so it makes sense to take advantage of it. The gauge wire on the load side of the transformer is 25 gauge, but on the circuit side it's 17 gauge. And then the two little coils in the left, representing the left sphere, is 57 og to be able to come out to one. I was trying to get it to come out to 1.5 milliohms of resistance. Actually, that's incorrect. It should be 3 milliohms, so it's not going to exactly be that. I forgot to double it or triple it on this one. Anyway, in that ballpark, let's put it that way. And I split this to 800 and 800 milliohms, hoping that the ratio between the volts and the amps would come out to be suitable for my car, namely 1.67 volts to amps. It didn't work that way. Instead, if we stop this, it takes 34 seconds to reach my target, which I'll show you in a minute what the target is, if I can get there. Alright, so, well, why don't I show you the initial charge first. So the initial charge on coming from the ignition coil, is 210 milliwatts negative and 200 milliwatts positive. So I figure that's about half a watt. So we've got something like 5 microamps and of course 40,000 volts. Now I measured the voltage on the top capacitor here and the top capacitor here. And I have them labeled, left sphere, right sphere. But they're the capacitor alone. And it's already growing quite high, microwatts, in only over 1.5 seconds. Meanwhile, the load capacitor over here, the 1,000 farad load capacitor, is exhibiting yocto watts, and that's just a surge. That's a spike. It's actually quite zero after the spike. The volts are beginning to dip down into the negative, though. They're starting to move. So it takes 35 seconds or so for this to exhibit the target load, or the target for my load that I want, which is 60,000 watts. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get the proportional ratio between watts and volts that I wanted, so it's dipping down in the negative, so I got instead 7.86 kiloamps, and 7.57 volts. So it's 1,000 to 1 between the amps and the volts. Kind of ridiculous. Meanwhile, over here on these capacitors, it's the reverse situation. I got 50 megaamps versus, oh my god, what's this? 333 ettavolts. Well, let's see if I can remember my scientific notation. We have kilo, then we have mega, so there's mega. Then we have giga, that's 1,000 times more than a mega. Then we have tera. Then we have peta or peta, and then we have, it's either eta or exa. I think it's exa in the case of the big values. And then whatever. So that's a lot of volts. And let's see. So mega, let's see if I can count mega. Giga, tera, peta, exa, what is that? 4 times 3. It's 12 zeros higher than the 6 zeros of the mega. That's what these the voltage is. On this capacitor up here. Now this is a 135 femtofarad capacitor. All my capacitors are femtofarad capacitors in the range of about 100 femtos, except for this one, the load one, is 1,000. Yeah, that's all. All my resistances are 1.5 milliohms, except for the 100 mega ohm resistors, the pair of them on either side of the ignition coil, and then representing the resistance of the coil, since I'm using the simpler version of Paul Falstad's simulator, his version, in which he does not allow for resistance inside of coils or capacitors. So I flanked it on either side to represent 1.6 ohms of resistance on this 1 Henry coil to the right, and 3 milliohms of resistance on the left-hand coil of this transformer, which is only 10 millihenries on the left, and a 25 gauge wire on the right and a 17 gauge wire on the left. So it's not quite that, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. Now, because of the windings being 100, or the inductance being 100 to 1, and I figured the windings is 10 to 1, why don't I go for the worst case scenario and make a 50% mutual inductance between these two coils? So despite all of that, and the resistances distributed throughout the circuit, it still can achieve over unity. It just takes longer, that's all. You'll get, the more resistance there is, the more you'll find a surge in the beginning. The surge dies out, but you shouldn't give up at that point just because it's dying out. It's not conventional. This is not a conventional circuit. There's nowhere for the energy to go. It gets all piled up and accumulates itself on the inside of this thing. So you just wait, and then what was a dip ends up being a rise. So see, the watts here are rising. All 3 watts are rising. But if we go back to the initial condition, it shows here that we had a spike of watts, and then it dropped, and then it came back up again. It recovered. Now here, the right, that's the left sphere. The right sphere, it takes longer to recover. It spiked up, and now it's going down into the negative, and it'll curl around and come back up into the positive. And of course, the ignition coil is just a spike for a fraction of a second. It's because I use a snap switch up here, 2 snap switches on either side that work together. And here, the voltage spiked downwards. It went back to the 0 midline, but then before it reached there, it started curling back down into the negative. So the volts are going to lead the amps in the beginning, but the amps are going to catch up and overtake the volts. This is femtovolts spike and nanoamps. Well, actually, no, it doesn't overtake it because the amps are a bigger spike to begin with. So the voltage doesn't even have a chance to catch up. Now, according to Paul Falstad's description of the color coding, green means a production of power, so we got it on the positive, the anode of the ignition coil, while red means a consumption of power. That means this whole circuit is consuming power except for gray, which is neutral, and that's this area in here, relatively speaking, neutral. He has a certain threshold at which he brings in the color gradually by degree, and then it's full force. And it tends to be somewhere in the vicinity of micro and milli units of measurement, as I may recall. Anyway, red means consumption, which means technically this circuit is consuming power, yet the power is going upwards. It's not going downwards. Other times I've seen it be green. Now, if you change, this is 1 millisecond time step. If you change that time step, of course you change the rate at which this thing escalates to oblivion. 2 milliseconds, double what this is at 1 millisecond, is a little too much. It goes too fast. It's all green though. Go figure. I don't understand what the circuit's doing, and I doubt Paul Falstad does. When I showed him initially 4 years ago what I was doing, he said, this can't be right. That's weird. Well, weird for him means not according to conventional wisdom yet, and he puts in corrections, policy-oriented corrections for his diodes and his transistors. If the amperage reaches 1,000, he just arbitrarily cuts it off and freezes the simulation. You can't go any further. So I had to change the code to get past that, because obviously conventional wisdom doesn't believe in over-unity circuits. They don't exist. Maybe they don't. Maybe this is just a fiction. But they certainly don't. I mean,
If that, I don't know. They have to muck around in there and decide to make a policy, and I had to take it out. And that was the only policy I ever found in Paul Fawstead's simulator. The other interesting thing is, when you get a convergence failed message, it's a fatal error, and it means the same thing in microcap matrix is singular. And I did the same thing to correct the problem here that I do in microcap. I went into each component and I slightly varied its parameters. And so now I can go to infinite oblivion and not get convergence failed error message in Paul Fawstead's simulator. I still get it in microcap matrix is singular, and that stops me from going all the way. Here I can go all the way, and you get 0, or you get numbers pushing to the right, and it becomes a smithering mess. I increased the range of scientific notation values in my instance of his simulator. He had giga at the top, and depending on the component, I think he didn't even allow you to go below 1 ohm of resistance. Well, no, when you roll your mouse. But no, you could go down to pico. That was it. So pico was the smallest unit of scientific notation that he utilized, and giga was the highest. And anything beyond that, the gigas and the picos kept just moving to the right. Well, the gigas moved to the right. Yeah, right, because the thing is surging. So I pushed it. Now, giga is, what is that? That's 9 zeros to the left of the decimal point. So e to the 9. I took it e to the 21. And I also took it to the e to the negative 21. So e to the 21, that's iota units of measurement, while e to the negative 21 is yocto. Iota, yocto. And, you know, it doesn't get any better than that. Scientific community doesn't have easily available words for me to find and discover what to use, so that's as far as I took it. Because in a lot of cases, when you're looking for the buildup, you don't see it in his. He doesn't have his color come on until much later, or his numbers for that matter. You just see 0, and it's sitting there at 0, and it's like, no, come on, it can't be sitting at 0, because if I wait long enough, I know I'm going to get something. So that's why I changed it. When you go into his code and change it, and then you put maximum value on the oscilloscope window, then you get to see it. Not only you see the numbers, but you get to see it scoped, traced. And that's really cool. So I had to make those changes to be able to operate, or else, come on. I'm dealing in something he never envisioned. And here's the shortcut. Now, this is a link-oriented circuit, so I don't have it on my website, so it's made on the fly from a link, a very long link that has all the information, and this is the shortcut URL redirect for that long link. So it's is.gd/2spheres_v 3, and that'll give you this circuit. What else? In its emptied format. In other words, I hit the reset button, it clears everything. And that was another thing. In his simulator, when you hit the reset button, it clears everything except it puts, I believe it was either a milli or a microvolt of charge on all of the capacitors. And he says that's normal for capacitors. Yeah, that's nice. But I have to start from scratch in all my simulations. I can't start with a pre-charge on my capacitors because it tends to throw me off. Now, it doesn't mean it won't. Well, it may not work. Quite frankly, if all the capacitors have the same charge on them. Well, no, in certain cases that was the case in the very beginning when I was working with this simulator. Now, I don't think it would make a difference. It would just explode in your face a whole lot faster. Instead of taking 35 or 34 seconds to reach the target of 100,000 watts on the load, God knows what it's. These poor spheres are frying to death. So maybe it's not a good idea to use an electrical equivalent. Maybe it's better to go to the Ammann brothers version and just do 2 spheres. Keep it simple, and don't try to do what Tesla might have done. Well, he used vacuum tubes, so he got away with it. And that's almost what you have to do for these capacitors. They pretty much have to be vacuum tubes to withstand the high voltages that they're being subjected to. If you're going to go this route as opposed to the Ammann brothers route. So this is what I envision Tesla may have done, or what I would do trying to guess estimate what Tesla did. But the Ammann brothers did the safer version. They just had 2 copper spheres. And since they replaced their headlights with the 2 spheres, putting each sphere where the headlight used to be in their car, it's a guess why did they put them there? They could have put them anywhere. Why did they put them inside the headlight sockets? Well, because they're using the electrical system of the car to charge the copper spheres. Now, I just assumed in most instances that they were using the raw voltage from the 6-volt battery that were in cars in that era. And then I thought to myself, these spark gaps don't work very well unless they're neon bulbs. Neon bulbs won't withstand the voltages. They got to be normal spark gaps. See, there's nothing wrong with using an electrical equivalent to test this thing. But when it comes time to building it, doesn't mean you need or would want to do it this way. But I do have to figure out stuff. So using a normal spark gap means I have to have a higher voltage to snap in here to work against resistances within the circuit and be able to get the voltage sparking, or the high voltage, to show up in the center of the sphere. To do that, I had to raise the voltage being snapped into the circuit for just an instant, because you don't need any current, you just need voltage to cross the threshold and break down the spark gaps so that they can fire. If they don't fire, this thing is going to go to 0. The spark gaps have to fire. So I had to use a higher voltage here, which means probably what they're doing is they retain the ignition coil and they put one terminal of the ignition coil going to one sphere and the other terminal of the ignition coil going to the other sphere. And then just a snap switch to charge up the 2 spheres with opposing voltages of 40,000 volts difference between them, and then let the circuit run from that point onwards on its own. That's what I'm guessing they did. That's my best guess estimate of what they did. And Tesla would have done something similar, I would imagine. Now, how you construct the spheres, I haven't a clue. Do you entirely fill the interior with a dielectrical material such as tar? They could have used tar if they wanted to. I don't know. Or do you just tar the inside surface of the sphere? The outside was bare, but the inside, I would imagine, might benefit from a dielectrical coating on the inside, but maybe not. Maybe it was just bare like the outside was, because you got the air acting as a dielectric. I just thought if you coat the inside, it would ruin the idea of arcing, but we want to encourage arcing. So you see, dielectrical on the inside surface doesn't work. There has to be bare on both the inside and the outside surface of the copper sphere, so that you can get ionization and arcing happen on the interior of the sphere, and not have to worry about it because it's enclosed, it's out of the way, nice and safe. But it's a single wire connection between the spheres. The only reason why I have this other here is I'm isolating the load circuit of the car from this power supply circuit. And then I have a step-up voltage between this power supply circuit and the load circuit. And I don't depict the motor coil here, unless it's the right-hand coil here, with a capacitor off to one side. That we normally put a capacitor in parallel with the 2 terminals of a motor, and then a diode here to ensure that this motor behave in a DC fashion. No. That's not going to happen. This is still going to oscillate over here. It's only going to be DC over in this loop here. So that means the motor coil has to be somewhere else to the right of this, I would imagine. Or something. Or maybe, no, in series with the diode. Yeah. Or no, anywhere within this loop. Right. Hey, whatever. I don't know. It's all guesswork. But I don't worry about resonance, because resonance has nothing to do with this circuit. Pretty much. All you do is wait. Which means, now how do you shut this off and how do you regulate it? Your guess is as good as mine. Because, quite frankly, if you put a ground on both terminals on either side of each capacitor, you'll remove all the voltage from the circuit, but you'll still be left with the amperage that was there before you grounded it out. And if you take away the grounds and restart the simulation, it goes back to normal, like you didn't do anything. So literally the capacitors are storing the memory of amperage of all things and forgetting they had any voltage by grounding out both terminals of all of the capacitors. Now, how weird is that? That doesn't even make any sense. And is it realistic to assume that the simulator is accurately depicting reality? I don't know. But for a capacitor to store amperage, which cannot pass through the dielectric anyway, and no voltage, and oh god, and then go back to emitting both when it gets reconnected to the circuit without any grounds in place, that is really bizarre. But that's the kind of trouble I have trying to work with these kinds of circuits. I haven't a clue how to turn them off. Really, I don't have a clue. Now, maybe I should have shorted out the two transformers with each other, bypassing these two capacitances and the transformer in the middle. It won't do any good, I betcha. It won't do any good because each sphere is an independent producer of energy, with the spark gap in the middle driving the damn thing. So I don't know. I really don't have a clue how you turn this thing off, because if we knew how to turn it off, we'd know how to regulate it. We could put in switches, mechanical switches, let's say, with a timer, a clock timer, with a 50% duty cycle, and then swap out various elements of the circuit to kill the overunity and then re-engage it, so we end up with surges that would even out to an RMS average of our target goal. That's normally the way I would approach it, but I don't know how to implement it. You just got this vague idea, well, that would work nice if I knew how to do it, but I don't know how to do it. How did the Ammann brothers do it? Well, there's no real load here. This section just means this is the jumping point that you jump off into your load. Now we know that with a load, such as a motor, it becomes a generator, which is going to work against this and create magnetic drag. The only time I know of that actually kills this thing, I think, is a current source. But I haven't tried that. Because a current source is a fixed value of current, and it allows the voltage to vary. Since this was driven by a voltage source, I'm guessing you have to do the opposite to kill this thing. You have to use some kind of current source and intermittently insert it and remove it to kill this overunity. And then you got to drain it somewhere at the same time so you don't get a flash explosion. That might remove the current on all the capacitors. That's right. I didn't think of that. That's right. So you ground all the capacitors and then engage the current source, then replace maybe the current source has to be 0. Yeah, what would you use as a 0 current source? If there is, I don't even know. I've never done investigation on what are real world analogs for the current source in a simulator. I don't know. I know what a real world voltage source is, battery, generator, but a current source, I don't have a clue. I've never looked into that. Anyway, there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but at least in Paul Falstad's simulator, I was able to go a little further with it. No, I could go all the way to infinite gain. And that's really nice. And it's more or less behaving the same way it does in microcap, microcap version of Berkeley Spice. So I got a pretty good idea that, I'm a pretty good hope that it's still a pretty basic idea that's not peculiar or anomalous, like it only works in microcap and it can't be right. There must be something wrong with the idea. No, I think what the Ammann brothers did, however they actually did it, is a valid idea. And the reason why I insist on always putting a diode in the circuit, whether or not it needs it, is because the newspaper reporter reported to us that they did use a mineral along with iron and wire to make their circuit function. And the iron, of course, is not needed in this simulation. So that might be unrealistic. In other words, you just have a normal transformer with an iron core. But you don't have the excess iron of this steel drum that I'm assuming they had, because a wooden drum would have been rounded on the sides, a wooden keg of that era. But a steel drum would have had flat sides, which is exactly what the photograph in the newspaper article depicts. So I'm assuming it was a steel drum, not a non-steel drum, which means they have magnetic capture surrounding the coil, as well as probably an iron core down the center, but magnetically coupled to the top and bottom of that steel drum to create an entire apple-shaped, or if you prefer, the Earth-shaped magnetosphere. The magnetism coming out one pole, wrapping around and going in the other pole, creating a kind of a slice crosswise through the core of an apple, creating that kind of a shape. Two spheres squished together, two gears, a figure eight, basically, a figure eight, kind of. Yeah, sort of. Except it's not the same pathway as a figure eight. It's more like a pathway of two gears rotating together. So this is the best I can do so far, but it's making progress, and I like the idea because knowing that they did it, and they did very simple version, reassures me that I don't have to have the technical savvy of a Tesla to be able to work the problem. It's just going to take more work, obviously, to try to figure it out before actually building the thing, because this is dangerous if you don't know how to regulate. Oh, so when they said a mineral, I'm assuming it was a diode with either a baking soda electrolyte or a borax electrolyte, and an aluminum anode, and then some other metal. 100 years ago they would have used lead possibly for the cathode of that diode, and that creates a diode. So these are all simple ideas, and then just a glass plate capacitor to give us 100 femtofarads for these capacitors over here, and then I don't know what kind of capacitor would give 1,000 farads capacitance of a century ago. I don't know if it has to be a kilofarad. I just put that in arbitrarily, and I never tried a different value. So don't take it as a lock, stock rule of thumb that it's got to be 1 kilofarads here, or any capacitor here. I just put it in thinking it would be a good idea, and it probably is a good idea, and something more than what these capacitors are, because these are the ones to generate power, because they'll discharge very readily, they won't charge very readily, and so all the energy will get dumped out into the circuit, which is what I want. When it comes to a surge-oriented circuit, I've always found that to be the case. To make inductances low, like 1 microhenry, and capacitances very low, so that all the energy keeps getting dumped out into the circuit and doesn't charge the coil or charge the capacitor very readily. So it's got to be more readily discharge-oriented and less readily charge-oriented in order to produce a surge, most of the time. Most of the cases. That's like a general rule of thumb. And then in your load area, you can do whatever you want. You can have 1 henry on the coil over here and a kilofarad over here in your capacitor, because you want to soak up the energy and you want to create torque. So you're going to want to store the energy. Let's see. I think that's everything. Okay.